Okay, so following on from my video last week looking at the Spawn Redeemer figure, today I'm going to be taking a look at the Clown figure from the same line. Now, Clown is a pretty interesting character. He's quite gross, quite disgusting. He's revolting in many ways. And I don't think he really naturally lends himself to toy form, to be honest. He's short, he's squat, he's fat. You're never really going to get a great deal of articulation out of him. But nevertheless, he is a really key character in the Spawn universe. He's the first major antagonist we're introduced to in the comic books, and obviously he's a huge part of the lore. And naturally, for a character that's been around 30 years or so, he's had a number of different looks. Now, for myself, I kind of stopped reading Spawn comics around about issue 120, so I'm well behind in terms of keeping up with what is current in the Spawn universe. So my memories of Clown and the way I visualise him in my mind's eye is probably a little bit out of date. But needless to say, there have been a number of figures produced by McFarlane Toys across the years on this character, starting out with these very simple first initial lineup of toys to these much more hyper-detailed figures that came later on. Now, historically, as I've mentioned in many videos, McFarlane Toys were more focused on their detail and the statuesque, lifelike appearance than articulation in these figures, but in recent years they've definitely changed their philosophy and they've definitely increased the articulation that we see, and they are a real competitor now with any of the other major toy lines on the market. So I'm really pleased to finally be able to get my hands on a classic looking Clown figure to add to my collection. So then, starting with the packaging, I was actually surprised when this figure arrived because he's in this big oversized packaging, and this is quite a big long box that we see the figure in. As you can see, it is mostly window display, so we have obviously Clown on display there, but he also has this massive contraption, this sort of armory to the side of him as well. So obviously this is all spread out, laid out horizontally, and we have everything on display here. So all in all, this looks pretty attractive. This looks quite displayable. Not a lot else going on in terms of the rest of the packaging. We just have obviously the Spawn logo in the bottom left hand corner there, and of course the character's name. Fairly bland, fairly basic in terms of its colouring, not a lot else going on. Things do get better with the side panel though, because here we have some artwork of the Clown. Now, this doesn't look like Todd McFarlane's pencils to me, so I think this might be another interpretation, another artist's impression of the character taken from a comic book, I guess. I'm not entirely sure. Like I said, I'm a little bit out of date, but nevertheless, this is quite a striking image, and because this side panel is quite fat, it's quite a big panel there, this would look pretty good on the shelf. And then finally on the reverse, we have this huge image that is basically just one photo of the figure in all his glory there. This is a nicely produced photograph. It looks pretty good. It definitely sells the figure to me. It looks really good. And then there's not a lot else going on, really. The backdrop is a sort of cartoon wall, and we have the nice faded logo of the Spawn face there, which I think is pretty cool. But again, otherwise fairly simple, but I think quite displayable and quite presentable, and I think this looks pretty decent. So then the figure himself. Now, I think the first thing you'll notice when you get this character out of the box is that actually he's fairly chunky. He feels a good weight in your hands. I absolutely love this head sculpt. I think they've just knocked this out of the park. Everything about this works for me. The sculpt itself is brilliant. It looks really monstrous, really unpleasant. Just what I am used to seeing in the comic book. So it looks perfect. I love those really hard, sharp razor teeth that he's got there. The grimace on the face, the eyes. Everything about it looks fantastic. But then the paint apps are really well applied as well. I love the blue on the front of the face there. But even on the hair and on the skin, it just all comes together to look really good. And as I said, on the teeth in particular. So I think this is a really solid head sculpt. I really like this. I think they've done a fantastic job of capturing the spirit of this character. Now, likewise, the proportions of the body look to be pretty perfect to me. This definitely looks like a unique mold. I don't think they're going to be able to reuse this anywhere else. I think it looks pretty solid. I think they've done a very nice job with the leather jacket and the belt and the trousers. All looks good stuff, and of course, it's all painted very nicely as well. Now, the jacket is mostly one colour, which is the rubber blue, but there is a little bit detailing when it comes to the silver of the zip, and on the belt in particular, there's a lot of different washes going through to make this look, authentic and lived in and used, which is great. Now, the one thing I was a little bit disappointed by was this bullet bandana. It's nicely sculpted and painted, no issues there, but sadly it is actually part of the jacket, so it's not removable. So if you wanted a clown without this bullet bandana, unfortunately, you can't remove it. It is stuck into the costume, so he's always going to be in gun-toting mode. And then the other thing to point out is that on the back there's this huge gaping hole, which is where the backpack straps into, so I completely understand why it's there and it makes sense. But because the colour is such a bright yellow, it's really noticeable. So I wish that had been painted blue, because then at least you could have been distracted, maybe look past it. As it is, it's really obvious and really very striking, so you're going to need to have this figure on display constantly looking forwards. But again, I really do like the sculpt of the jeans and the boots. The jeans in particular have a nice white wash running through them, which really emphasises the sculpt and the creases in the pants, which I think looks absolutely fantastic. And then the boots obviously have those spikes on the toes there. So I think all this looks really good, very nicely presented. So how does he fare for articulation? Well, he has a ball joint at the neck, believe it or not, so he can spin his head from side to side, he can rotate it right the way around, and it even nods forwards and backwards, a pretty decent distance all things considered. Now, because of the size of his head and being so round, and because of the limited neck space that he actually has, obviously his head is just really sitting on his shoulders, there's not a huge range of motion here, but there's more than I was expecting. Now, he also has ball joints in the shoulders, and you'll notice there's also a butterfly wing effect as well going on. So he actually is able to get his arm back quite a good distance there, and then the ball joint is able to rotate up and down and really swing those arms out. So again, this was a real surprise for me. I wasn't expecting to get this amount of articulation, this amount range of motion out of the arms, so that's fantastic. There's a pin swivel at the elbow, so of course the lower arm spins 360 degrees, but also hinges in. Not quite to 90 degrees, sadly. Again, the arms are just too chunky for that, but nevertheless, a decent amount of articulation here. Now again, he's got a pretty ugly joint at the wrist where it hinges, so it can look at odds sometimes when it's hinging forwards and backwards, but he can hinge it forwards and backwards, which is great, and of course he can rotate the hand as well to 360 degrees, which is good. And of course he also has a ball joint in the waist as well, which is really good for getting a wide range of motion here. He can spin from side to side, he can wobble forwards and backwards, and this is really very healthy. So pretty fantastic range of motion here, can't complain at all. He has hinge hips, so he can kick his legs out to the side there, and thankfully this is nicely disguised by the sculpt of the jeans, so you can't really see the joint until you really kick them out, and even then it's difficult to see. Now, unsurprisingly, the legs can't really kick too far forwards or backwards, but then, you know, they are very short legs, so there's only so much they can do, and I think there's a decent range of motion for all that. There is another pin swivel at the knee though, which is great, so of course we can spin the lower leg right the way around, and we can hinge it to about maybe 30 degrees. And then finally, there's also a ball joint at the ankle as well. So of course he can sort of spin his foot from side to side, and there's a little bit of a hinge there that allows the foot to go forwards and backwards. And then this is all finally supported with some toe articulation as well. So we can hinge that forwards and then flat as well. Now, surprisingly, for a character that I don't really associate with having any accessories, he does come with quite a few, including an extra pair of hands, a switchblade razor, a knife, and then this huge monstrosity, which is an all-in-one armory by the looks of it. Now, both of these knives fit very nicely and comfortably into his grip on either hand. They look pretty decent. Sadly, the switchblade isn't articulated, so it is permanently in this mode, but in the main, they're nicely painted. They're just two tones, just the black and the silver, but they are sculpted nicely, they do the job, and they look to scale. And like I said, there's no issues whatsoever in terms of him holding them. They fit very snugly in his grip. So then we have to look at this backpack, for lack of a better term. I'm not quite sure what to call this. Now, I have to say, this looks quite exaggerated to me and a bit silly. I'm not sure if this actually appears in the comic books. I'm guessing it must do. Why else would he come with it? And I've seen other figures with something similar, so I'm guessing this must be a moment in the comic books where they go all in, and it looks, to me, it looks a bit exaggerated, a bit over the top, and not really what I want for this character in terms of how I'm going to display him. But nevertheless, it is really cool that he comes with it. It definitely has a deluxe feel, and it looks quite impressive for what it is. At the base of the backpack there is this rubber tube which leads to a handle which can fit quite snugly into Clown's grasp. Again, this is nicely painted, so it's nicely sculpted. There's a lot of detail on it in terms of the grip and on the tubing and the wires. It all looks pretty good, but it's also complemented by a nice silver paint wash running through it to, again, make it look a bit more authentic and make it look a bit more metallic, and it looks pretty solid. And the same runs through the body of the rest of the backpack as well. Nicely painted, nicely sculpted. Now, in terms of how it fits into his back, obviously we did see that gaping hole before. It does literally just slide in, so you kind of have to mesh them together. But it seems to hold itself pretty steady. Obviously, the figure is going to be top heavy, so he is going to lean forward somewhat with the weight of this. So that's something to be aware of. Now, believe it or not, this is actually articulated. So some of these weapons at the top here actually have ball joints and hinges to allow you to be able to pose them in multiple different positions. Now, you're always going to be fighting gravity. That's something to keep in mind. So really, I'm going to recommend that you have them sort of facing down and quite towards the front to help Clown balance. Otherwise, he's going to fall over. But that said, he does a pretty decent job. Each gun arm is able to rotate to the side, which is quite nice. And there's also hinges there to control whether it's lifted up or backwards or not. And then there's a final ball joint at the very, very top there, again, to control the position and the angle of the actual weapon itself. So you've got a lot of options when it comes to posing these guns. There's also a much smaller array just at the very top of the backpack, just over the head of Clown, and you can see again that this can be rotated forwards or backwards, and it looks pretty good and it's pretty solid. So I think all in all, yeah, they've done a pretty nice job of this, really. Clearly, there's no issues when it comes to the sculpting. There's a lot of detail on these weapons. They look very elaborate, and they've clearly put a lot of effort into giving them a lot of detail, lots of rivets, grooves, barrels, and bits and pieces. These look very threatening, and they look really good. And like I said, it's all complemented by that sort of metallic wash that's running through them as well to make them look like they've been used. So all in all, this, for what it is, I think this looks pretty good. There's definitely some issues with it in terms of balance, and one thing to bear in mind, which I was very frustrated with mine, is when you try to put this back in the box, it has to go back in a very specific way. Otherwise, what you may find is that some of these joints start to tear off on this backpack because it is all held together with rubber, and the pieces do want to pop off out of their joints, and if you're not careful, they will also tear out of their joints if you're not bending them the right way. So something to bear in mind, because this could lead to disappointment. And then finally, for the sake of giving it a scale comparison, here he is standing next to the Mortal Kombat Spawn, which for me is going to be my definitive Spawn until he gets his own release in this line. This is, for me, the forerunner to this reinvigorated Spawn line that we're seeing at the moment. So I think this looks pretty good. I think, you know, in terms of scale, really, Clown should probably be a little bit shorter, but nevertheless, I think, you know, it's a happy compromise in terms of being able to get all that fantastic articulation out of him. I think it's a really good mold, and I think this scaling pretty much works. I think this is fairly solid. I'm not too unhappy with this. There is a pretty significant height differential between the two, and overall they look pretty decent together. So there you have it. I think for me, I really, really like this figure. I'm a huge fan. I would have been happy with just Clown on his own without the backpack, but I think the backpack is an added incentive. I think it makes this figure deluxe, and I think it gives you a bit more bang for your buck as well in terms of displaying him with this. It definitely gives him a lot more stature and a bit more of a deluxe presence on the shelf space. So I think overall, I think whether you particularly like this look or whether you just want a classic Clown figure, I think you're going to be pretty happy with this figure. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.